Welcome to the Flex Rental Solutions webinar. Today we're going to look at how you can build something of a job checklist in Flex. It's something that will be a child element attached to your quote or your event folder. We're going to do this using project elements. So we're going to build a new project element that's called a custom form element. And I'll just say this right from the top, there's not really a way to delete project elements from your system. So if you want to do this and you're going to create a new element, just know that that will be in your system. And if you end up not wanting to use it, you could just name it something else. Like here, I did a test one earlier and I just disabled it, but it will still technically be in your system. I always just like to say that as a warning because there's not really an easy way to just delete elements here in your Flex system. It will take having to work with Flex support, and a developer will have to go into your system to delete that, and it will take some time and probably cost some money. There's a really good reason why we don't let you delete elements, because if you do accidentally X out one of these elements like your quote or invoice or any of your other important elements, it will really throw your system into a big mess. So we don't allow that, but just warning you so that once you create this, you'll know that it will be in your system. So just a little bit of background and why I want to show you how to do this, and maybe a little bit of info and what I've done for other customers, and some of the reasons why I think this is a useful feature that you can put into your system. I was training a customer earlier this year or sometime last year, and they had something of a job checklist. It was a pre-designed PDF, something that they had created that they would print out and fill out just by hand, or maybe they'd fill it out in a PDF editor, and it would just have general information about the job. So it would have things like the ship date, all of the load in, show start, load out dates, might have the shipping method, who the client was, who the account manager was, but then it also might have some other information like what is the dress code for that job, or if there are any additional notes about the venue or anything that they need to know about who's going to be on site and things like that. So I have just an example. This isn't the actual customer that I was dealing with, but I just wanted to show an example of what I'm talking about. So like something like this, an event checklist. This would be something that the customer would either print out and fill out by hand, or have to fill out in a PDF editor or something, and it's just an extra step. It's something that they didn't necessarily want to have to do every single time. They thought, most of this information is in Flex already. Why don't we just create something that can be kicked out of Flex that has all of this information already pre-filled in there? And then the last step in that process was to take all that information, put it into some sort of checklist element, but then also keep the branding. So as you can see here, there's some really nice branding with this pink marketing checklist here. So the customer wanted to keep the branding of their company, keep the nice look and layout of their checklist, but have all the information automatically populate from Flex. So we came up with this idea where we create a new element and then have it either inherit information or have fields that we can enter that information into that new element. So let's look at how we can do that. As you can see, I already have a test quote created. And what I want to do now is go into my project elements. And like I said, we're just going to straight up create that new element now. It's called a custom form element. And just again, if you came in a little bit late, once you create this element, there's no way to delete it from your system. So if you create that element, just know that it will be in your system. And if you do want to disable it, you can, but you can't really delete it from your system. There's not an X or anything to get that out. So I'm going to go ahead and create that. Just click New Custom Form Element. And what I usually like to do is just give it the top 4 or 5 basic info and then save it, just so that all of my work is saved as I go. So I'm going to call this just my job. I could call it a job checklist or job sheet, event checklist, event sheet, whatever I want. Let's just go with event checklist. The code doesn't really matter. It could just be an abbreviation of the name. And then the name plural, of course, is just the same thing, except you put the pluralized version. And that's just for like when you go to the projects menu, Flex just needs to know what to call the different things that are on the projects menu, like quotes, sales quotes, etc. The name caption, we typically just put name. And then you can choose an icon. We already have a checklist or a check icon or a list with some checks, so you could choose either any of those, or you can upload another one in your system settings in the icon library, but I typically just use the one that we already have in the system. Like I said, once I filled in that, I just like to hit update to create that element. And one thing that I noticed is that sometimes that will throw an error at you. I typically will just click through that error, but then I notice that it will actually still create the element. So if you do see an error that gets thrown up after you create that custom form element, just go back to your project element definitions and reload, and you might be surprised to see that it actually did get created, even if it did throw an error. That time I got lucky and it didn't throw an error, so that's nice. But if you do see that, like I said, just try to click through it and then reload, and you might see it actually got created. Now that it's been created, let's just set some of the high-level options. First of all, I want it to be enabled, yes, so that I can actually use it. And then I always will set it as top-level element, show on the new element menu, which means this one right up here. If I go to new, I could create one just from scratch. And then I also like to put it on the project module menu, which means that I can come to the projects menu and find job checklists or event checklists on this menu here and be able to search and find event checklists. I also like to set naming enabled to yes. That just means that I'll be able to give it a name. You could also say name inherited yes, which means it will just inherit the name of the quote. So that's a yes or no option. I like to say yes, just so I don't have to think about giving it a name. I also like to say it's move enabled yes. That means that if I create one from scratch and I want to move it into an event folder or a quote, then I'll be able to move it. And you could also say copying enabled yes. And a lot of these other options here are either just not really applicable to this checklist, or they're pretty self-explanatory. Like if you want to associate a department with your checklist, which frankly I don't really see why you would want to, but you could set some of those to yes if you want. I might also say name override enabled, so it's going to inherit the name from the quote or the event folder, but I could also override that if I want. I'm not going to give this a workflow either. You certainly could. If you want to create a new workflow for a job checklist, you could, and then assign that workflow to this checklist element, but I'm not going to. I don't really think this needs a workflow. Again, I always just like to click update as I go, just so that I don't lose any of my changes. Let's go to the next tab, the field settings. The field settings are going to be the different fields that you can put information into. So for example, if we go back to our quote, all these different fields are things like ship date, load in, show start, load out. We could go into our quote project element settings and we can enable more of these fields if we want. So right now I really only had a few of those fields enabled. So if we look at field settings for my quote, as you saw, I had like load in date enabled. I don't have rehearsal date enabled though. I don't have event date enabled. And the reason I show you this is because a lot of times you might just want to start putting that information in at a quote level and then having it inherit when you get to your custom form or to your checklist. So right now, all I'm really going to do is say shipping method is enabled and it's inherited, yes. I can override it if I want. But let's just go with the fields that I already have enabled on my quote, like load in date. I'm going to enable that. I do want it to be inherited from the quote. And maybe I want to be able to override it as well. That's up to you. Let's go back to my quote settings and just remember what else I have enabled. So no doors date, no rehearsal date. I do have show start enabled, and I have load out date enabled. So let's go back to our custom form element and enable those as well and have them inherit. So show start enabled, yes. I want it to inherit from its parent, whether it be a quote or an event folder. And just my personal choice, I want to be able to override it just in case. Same with loadout date. I'm just going to say yes on all of the loadout date. Enabled, inherited, and I can override it. Now keep in mind, if you want to be able to put any of these other fields into your job checklist or your event checklist, you certainly can enable them. So maybe I want event date to be enabled, but right now I don't have event date enabled on my quote. So I'll be able to put an event date into my custom form, into my job checklist, but it's not going to inherit from a quote because I don't have that field enabled on my quote. So just keep that in mind. If you're enabling a field on your custom form element, your checklist here, if you want it to inherit from a parent, then you have to make sure that that is also enabled on the parent element settings. So I'd have to go into my quote settings and enable event date yes. Or if I'm creating a event checklist from an event folder, then I'd have to go into my project element settings for the event folder, look at the field settings and make sure that that field is enabled. In fact, it looks like not many of those fields are enabled in my event folder. So I just have to go through and anything that I want the checklist to inherit from the event folder, I just have to go through and make sure that they're enabled. I'm not going to do that right now because that'll take a bit of time, but I just want you to be aware of that if you are enabling any of these fields in your custom form or your checklist element, and you want it to inherit from a parent, you just have to make sure that those are enabled in the parent element as well. So again, not going to go through all that, but I have enabled quite a few of these here. And I'll just make sure that we're updated and then move on to the next few tabs. You can also, just like a quote or any other of your elements, you can have them numbered. I personally don't really care if these checklists are numbered, but if you want them to be, then just set that to yes, choose what numbering scheme you want to use, and then there's a few other options as well, but I'm not going to number my checklists. Same with statuses. Remember, I didn't even set a workflow to this custom form element, so I'm not going to bother with any statuses either. Child elements is going to be what kind of child elements do I want to add to this event checklist. This is more than likely just going to be a bottom level element, so I'm not going to add any child elements to this checklist, but I want to make sure that now that I have this created, I want to be able to add it from a quote or from an event folder. So we'll just go back to our project element settings, double click quote, and we're going to find this new event checklist that I just created and make sure that it can be added as a child element to the quote. So I open the quote project element settings, go to child elements, and just enable event checklist. That'll just make it so now when I have a quote open, all these options down at the bottom, it will give me the option now, if I reload, to add as a child element that event checklist. So there it is. We're not going to do that yet because we still have some more settings that we need to do in our custom form element or our checklist. We have reports as well. There's a couple built in. We have the job info sheet and a job checklist that might be useful for you, so I would just check those and click update. But like I said, to really get the most value out of this, you might want to create a custom report that keeps some of your branding and the look and feel of a checklist. The contact associations is another important one. These are the other fields that you might be entering from the quote that you want to inherit down to your checklist. So for example, the responsible person, we want that enabled. Business location, that's your warehouse location. Maybe the client, maybe the venue. So I'm just enabling all of these And I might even go down so far as to say maybe I want the technical director. And maybe all of these different contacts, I want them to be enabled so that I could put a contact or information into that field on my checklist. So I've enabled those, but I also have a few other things I need to do. So responsible person also needs a caption. When you're creating a quote and you enter who the account manager is, that's the responsible person. Account manager is just the caption. So if we go back to our settings, responsible person is enabled, but I need that caption. And in my system, I call it the account manager. I can also say whether or not it's required and whether or not it's inherited. In this case, I do want it inherited from the quote because I don't think that's going to change from the quote down to the checklist. And I could choose whether or not it's overridable. I just want it to inherit from the quote and I don't want it to change. Same thing with business location. In my system, I call that the warehouse. And I do want it to inherit from whatever parent element. And that's probably not going to change, so I'll just make sure that it has a caption, that it's inherited, and nothing else is set. Keep in mind, too, you don't want to set user default to any of these. Because if you set user default yes, it will look at whoever's creating this checklist, and it's going to default their contact name to these different fields. So I would keep those as no. It's useful to have those set to yes for when you're creating a quote or something like that, but I would say not so much for this checklist. Let's just go down the list, look at the other things I've enabled. So client is set to yes. I just want to make sure that also has a caption. I want that to inherit, and I don't want it to override. Venue, same thing. I just want to make sure there's a caption there. I want it to inherit, and I don't want to be able to override it. And then technical director, I don't believe I have this enabled on my quote. So just like in field settings, if I enable anything in contact associations for my custom form element, and if I want it to inherit, I just need to make sure that in the project element settings for the parent element, I also have that enabled. So right now, technical director is not enabled in my quote. So it won't inherit from a parent element even though I have it enabled. But then again, maybe you don't want to bother with putting the technical director on the quote level, so you only enable it on your job checklist and it's not inheriting, and so you'll just enter it by hand once you get to the job checklist. That's one way you could do it for sure. So that's all I'll do for now. I could certainly enable some more of these if I want, but that's where I'll stop. Just click Update. You also have security settings if you only want certain user groups to be able to view or edit your checklist. I could say only administrators and management will be able to edit this checklist. Anyone else can view it, but unless they belong to one of those groups, they won't be able to edit it. Or I could just leave them all blank and there's no security restrictions. The dates and times are important too, because remember on our quote, the dates and times that we have here, the start date and the end date, those are what we consider our ship date and return date. And if I want the custom form element to inherit those, I have to set that up in the dates and times tab for the custom form element settings. So I'm going to say dates inherited, yes. Start date is enabled, yes. And the caption is ship date. And that might be different in your system, but in my system, I call it the ship date. So that's what we're going to go with. And we also want to say there's a time component, yes, because it's going to enable from the quote. Same with end date. I just want to make sure it's enabled. In my system, I call that the return date. And it has a time component, yes. I'm not going to say it's required necessarily because it's inheriting from the quote. So those dates will just auto-populate and I don't have to worry about them being required. We can also set up custom fields for this element if we want. So if there's maybe a contact association that isn't available by default or some sort of field that you want to put in to your custom form element, then you could set up a custom field. We're not going to do any of those here because you can also set up some custom things on the Form tab. But if you have custom fields that are already set up, for example, in your quote, and then you want them to inherit down to any child elements, then you could set up those custom fields in your custom form element as well. And then search options has more to do with when you go to the projects menu and click the event checklist. That would just have to do with the different columns that show up on that screen. So like when I click projects, quotes, all these different columns are what I set up in the search options. I have another webinar on that. We're not going to look at that here just because that will take a little bit of time, but you just add those different columns by using a caption and an expression. Now the form is the really important part. Before we even get to that though, I just want to click update and I want to go add a new event checklist to this quote. So I have my quote open. I'm going to go down to add child elements and just click add event checklist. Notice what's happening so far. It inherited the name. It inherited the account manager, ship date, return date, warehouse client, venue, and the load-in date, show start date, loadout date, etc. Now remember how we set for these up here. I said there's no override enabled. So right now it's telling me this is inherited from the parent quote, and I can't edit that. But these ones down here, remember in the field settings, I said it is inheriting from the quote, but also it is override enabled. So if I want, I could change that. And you might want to set that differently in your custom element checklist settings. You might want to say that those aren't override enabled. And so if you want to change that date, you have to go back to the quote, and then this checklist will inherit it. So I just wanted to show you that there are two different ways you can do that. And then maybe I could go back later and actually put that event date, because remember I didn't enable event date on my quote, so there's nothing to inherit. I'll just click accept to create this new checklist. And like I said, that creates it as a child element. So I can access that, double click to open it, and it will open from that quote. But notice there's nothing there. Sure, I can access the information from edit header, but the whole point of this is that I want information to show on this custom form element, and I want to be able to print it out. And that's where this whole form tab comes in, because the form is what's going to show up when I create the new custom form element. So we'll go back to our settings and let's start filling in the information for the form. Let's start with some of that high level stuff that we already have set up. So example, the account manager. I'm not using a custom field, I'm using an expression to pull that information. And I know just from experience that that one is element.person responsible.name. If you're familiar with setting up calendars or setting up the search options tab, then you know what I'm talking about here. We use these expressions to pull data from the element to be able to display it. And that's the exact same thing that we're doing here. We're just using the expression to point to the person responsible, which we call the account manager, so that it will pull that information from the header and display it onto our custom form element. I do have to choose a type, and I just choose text. That just means it's going to display text, and it won't let me edit it because I'm pulling it from the database. So it's not even going to let me change that. It's just going to be display text that's pulling from the header of the custom form. So I add that to my list. And let's click update too, just because I want to show what this looks like. I'll go back to my checklist, reload it, and that's what I have so far. Let's go back to our form and start adding some other stuff. So maybe I want the client. So the caption is client. This one is also going to pull an expression. And I could launch the expression suggestions here if you need to find a specific expression and you don't know it offhand. So let's pull up client. And the one that I usually use is element.clientString, I think. I might change that, but I think that's the one that I usually use. And again, the type is just going to be text, and then I click Add. Let's maybe do the same for venue. This one I do know, venue string. And again, the type is just going to be display text. So again, any information that I have in my header, I can pull and put onto the form just by using these expressions. And remember, when I'm talking about the header, I mean all this information that you put in as you create the new element and when you click Edit Header. So if I reload this, here's what I have so far. Let's go back and add a few more things, like, for example, the ship date. And I don't remember the expression off the top of my head, so let's launch the expressions suggestions. I'm looking for load in. I like the timestamp version. That will just give a short date plus the time at the end, so I like to use that one personally, but you can use whatever you want. And again, it's just going to be, actually in this case, it's going to be a date and time field. So we'll add that to the list. Again, click Update. And let's go back and reload it just to see what that looks like. So I'm just building this form now, and it's going to have all that header information. And I could add as many of these fields as I want. So far, I'm really only doing, or I'm sorry, I did ship date, but I've searched for load in date. That was my mistake. Let's change that. I could just click into that expression and change it there. Flex is going to recognize it as the start date, resolve start date. Just because I call it ship date, the field itself is called the start date. So that's what Flex is looking for. Now let's do load in. I already have that set up here, so we'll just add it. We could do load out date. All I really need to do is just change that. Make sure it's chosen as a date time field. So we could do this with all the different fields that already exist. And we just use the expression to pull that information. So let's see what it looks like so far. Pretty good. Let's look at a couple other things we can do in our last few minutes here, adding things to this form. We don't necessarily have to use an expression. We could actually just enter some sort of text field, or we could enter some sort of option list. Let's do something like this. Maybe there are some special venue requirements. And it isn't necessarily something that you are going to choose from a list or anything like that. This just might be something you want to hand type in. I might just want that to be a text area. Or I'm sorry, I have to put in at least some sort of custom field. So I just choose from custom field, add new. The data type is just going to be text field or text area. I can say that there are only certain permissions are able to view this, but I usually don't do that. I just say none. There's no security group or security restriction. Field ID and project elements are optional. For this particular scenario, we don't use those. And I want to say it's editable, yes, in this case. So in that case, I don't actually have to put a type. I set that up in the custom field settings. Click update, what that looks like now. And I could save that. So again, if I just want to put some sort of text field, it could be anything really. And I could actually reuse any of these too. I'm going to add a new one and just call it. And And again, it's just a text area. Editable, yes, and then click Add. And you might be wondering, where do these custom fields go? When I create that, how can I go in and change those or delete those? That's in System Settings, Custom Fields. All those are getting added here. I don't think I clicked Update. Let's update and then just go back and reload again. So you see, I'm just building this list. One more type that we can add is on the forum is a selectable list or an option list. So we might have something like dress code. And I already created one here. But let's do one from scratch just because I want to show you how to do it. So I'm going to say add new. Let's call it something else just so we can... On this one, we're going to choose as the data type an option list. And once you choose that, you have to manage the options. So you might have casual. And I just usually choose that as an option list as well. We might have company logo t-shirt. Nice dress. Show blacks. I mean, all the different options you might have. And once you add those to the list, you just hit close and save that new custom field. Again, make sure it's editable, and then click Add to the list. I'll click Update, go back, reload my checklist. Now I have an option list that I could choose from. Let's just add a couple more so you can get the idea of how we're doing this. Let's do another one where we use an expression. So this one might be shipping method. Remember, we set that on the quote. I don't think this was in the suggested expressions, so we'll have to guess. Element dot shipping method. It might have a dot name at the end of it as well. The type is just going to be text. And again, I can't edit that because I chose to make it an expression, so it's not going to be editable because it's pulling that from the database. So add that to the list, click Update. Let's go back and reload to see what that looks like. And that's pulling from the quote because I had the shipping method inherit from the quote. And I could move all these around too, so maybe I want shipping method to be more up by venue. Maybe I want the warehouse to be up there too. Remember, this one was actually, it's not called warehouse, it's called the business location. In fact, in this case, I might have to guess on that one too. Element dot yeah, that one I don't recall exactly what the expression is, but I could put the warehouse or business location in there as well. Let's look at a couple other ones that we could do. A lot of times, so let's just look at a few of these custom fields. A lot of the data types are not going to be anything that you can use for this particular type of element. It's like pricing models, report format, all that stuff is applicable to other elements. Really, the ones that you might use the most are going to be a text area, if you just want a free enter text. The option list was a good one, of course. We also have free text, which I think is just a smaller text box. The dates and times, of course. And maybe a contact as well. The Boolean also is just going to be a yes or no option. So I might have a question or something like that. Like, is this client paid or something like that? And I could choose Boolean. Again, make sure it's editable and then add that to the list. Oh, didn't mean to call that warehouse. And what that looks like on the checklist is something like this. The question in the chat room is, can you just do like a to-do type item? And it doesn't look like we have that option to add, because that would have to be a custom field. I mean, probably the closest that you would have is either a Boolean where you check it yes or no if it's been completed, but not necessarily a checkbox that you can put into Flex. What you can do, however, is maybe just put a custom field like a text box or something like that, and then when you get to the actual printout, so if I run a report like the job checklist or something like that, what Flex will do is actually show more of a checklist format for this. And you can, whatever PDF thing that you're using, you can actually do those, check it yes or no. Mine seems to be kind of, oh, there we go. So put a check mark in there, but I'd have to delete that since I'm just using Apple Preview. But yeah, to put an actual check mark box in this element, we can't do that. But once you print it, then you can have checkboxes and whatnot there, or you could just do like a Boolean yes or no instead of a checkbox. But that's kind of the last thing I wanted to look at, is printing these out. We only have these two options, the job info sheet and the job checklist. Excuse me. Those are the default options, but you can do a custom report that will that you can organize this information however you want, brand it a little bit better. In fact, like I said, the company that I helped design this element for, the plan was for them to go and request a custom report from Flex Support that said, I want it to look just like this. I want fancy boxes off to the side. I want it to be formatted in this way so that it looked like their checklist that they already had created. And we can do that. Of course, there's a cost associated with that, but we could certainly do a custom report to make it kind of look and feel the way that you want it to if you don't like either of these options. For some people, though, it might not even be a matter of printout. It might just be you have that checklist created in Flex for internal purposes only. So that if somebody opens up this quote and if they have any questions about the progress of that quote or anything specific about that quote, then they can just open the checklist and see it right here in Flex. So that's one way that I've seen people use this, is just internal purposes only. They never even really print it out or create a PDF. But you do have these two options, and if you want it to look a little bit more fancy, you can order a custom report from Flex Support. So just as a quick review, what we did was went to Project Elements. We created a new custom form element. And again, once you create this, it's in your system, and there's not a way to delete it from the UI. I called it Event Checklist, and then I went in and just set up all these different options, the field settings, dates and times, and then started adding all the information that I wanted to show up on this checklist. I added it to the Form tab. And we did that by giving it a caption, the caption just being what you'll see in bold here. And then the actual information that gets pulled and shows up on that form is either going to come from an expression that it pulls information from the database that already exists in the Elements header, or you can add a custom field where you either do some sort of free text or an option list or a Boolean yes or no. And whenever you add one, just make sure that you choose whether or not it's editable, click Add to the list, and then click Update so that you can update the actual element itself. So hopefully that's helpful. And again, like I said, I just really want to make sure that we drive this point home that once you do create it in your system, it is in your system for good, unless you have a Flex developer go into your system and delete that, and there would be an extra charge with that. But what I see most people do is just create one, and if they decide they're not going to use it, you could just double click, go to the identity exposure, and just say it's enabled no. So then you're not going to see it on the projects menu anymore. You don't see it on the new menu. In fact, you could even rename it something like test do not use or something like that, and then just say enabled no, so that the only place you're ever going to see it is when you open project element definitions from the projects menu. You're not going to see it anywhere else. You won't see it from quotes. You won't see it on the menus or anything like that. So that's kind of the workaround, that if somebody creates one and then decides they don't want to use it, really the only way to have that not show anymore is to go into it and just say it's enabled no. So again, hopefully that's helpful to you. Hopefully you find some use out of that checklist. You can really put as much on there as you want from that form tab. I've seen some customers that have 20 or 30 options there. Just all the different information that they might want to know about a job, so that they can attach it to a quote or to an event folder and just have that information available to anybody who opens that quote or event folder. If you have any other questions about this, I always recommend going to our forum. It's just forum.flexrentalsolutions.com. We have lots of Flex users in there who are always talking about different ways to use the system, and some of them might have some experience creating one of these new custom form elements. If you're having some more technical issues, then you can email support@flexrentalsolutions.com.